Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Going to Be Alright. My name is Niklas Mitrovic.
And I'm, as always, Clayton Gwen.
And today, we're going to talk about Imposter Syndrome. Sounds very serious.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, it's a syndrome. After all, it's something that could be debilitating, but it also, to be an imposter, you know.
I think we're going to talk about this in the context of research, first and foremost, or being a student. But I think it's something that relates to every arena of life, that you sometimes feel like, you know, you're just kind of waiting for the moment when you're going to get exposed. Mm-hmm. They're going to see out that you don't know what you're doing, that you're a fraud, that, you know, the facade disappears and...
Yeah, exactly. And you're not the person that you've been claiming to be, or that others have been claiming you to be. And so I think the imposter syndrome is a fun one because from the standpoint of a student, especially when you come to, you know, your master's thesis is probably when it really is going to strike you. You know, did I produce research that was actually good enough? Do I deserve the degree that I'm getting? Do I deserve the grade? If you get any praise for the research you're doing, just the same sort of thing. And then I definitely see it happening at the Ph.D. level. And I have plenty of moments of it myself where it's like, oh man, what am I doing? Why am I qualified to be here at all? And it can happen at many points. Like I just recently received another rejection on a publication, and you have that moment of thought of like, oh, you know, when the experts are kind of calling you out on stuff, and you know it can hit a lot of people pretty hard. And then of course as you come into a professional career as well, these moments of realization where people are kind of relying on you to be the expert, but you might not feel like you're the expert. You might feel like an imposter, a fake, a phony, a fraud, however you want to describe it. You know, someone who isn't real or authentic or competent enough.
The reason that I'm kind of laughing about this is because I've felt like that many times in my life. You know, I remember just one example is the first couple of days as a student when I was a bachelor student. I remember I was in taking a course. I was in one of the introductory classes or something, and I remember they were introducing some very basic theoretical concepts, and I just did not understand what the hell they were talking about. And then I was feeling like, is this like, is this right for me? And I think this is kind of related to something that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but I think most people think that they are above average intelligent. Most people think that.
A lot of people tend to think, and not everybody, but a lot of people, I would agree, tend to think more highly of themselves.
So more highly of themselves than, you know, comparing themselves to other people, and obviously always seeing the flaws of other people and not their own flaws and stuff like that. But I remember having that feeling, like in the beginning, that is this really for me? Am I smart enough to even be a student, to be at a university? Like it worked out, but I remember that feeling, and I got the feeling again when I was a master's student, and suddenly this idea that I had, and similar to something that I had written my bachelor's thesis about, suddenly this was supposed to be like a master's thesis, something big, something very, and then I felt like a fish out of water. I had no clue how to write something like that, and the expectations felt like they felt
high,
real,
right?
Oh yes,
yeah.
And everything felt very serious.
You know, you come into a defense, now you have to defend this research that you've done that you're maybe suddenly uncertain about, and you know, when you pass, I think a lot of people are just relieved. But you know, the one thing that I've had through the years in consultations, and because I used to do workshops on master's thesis defense preparation, which if you're interested, if you're from NMBU, we have information in the SWR 100. I know we're always plugging that, but you know, I can't be doing absolutely everything all the time. So I've done my best to kind of put the condensed version of that workshop into SWR 100 under preparing for your thesis or something like that. So go check that out in Canvas.
And it's not like we're trying to sell anything.
No,
it's free,
it's free
and it's open for everybody. It's just a great resource.
It's just I still get emails from time to time. Oh, hey, do you still run these things? It's like, oh, I wish I had the time to. They're a lot of fun. But like a recurring theme was always people would be very timid, but they would end up saying like, should I talk about the things that went wrong in my research? Almost as if, admitting fault or failure kind of meant that the research that they had done was moot or irrelevant or, unworthy. And I think that that's part of the imposter syndrome. I apologize if you're hearing any superficial coffee grinder noise here. My colleague at the home office is obviously preparing for a long afternoon. But yeah, like it's real. People experience this from the master's thesis, throughout a PhD, throughout their career. I'm sure if you just have conversations with friends or family, no matter their age, their experience, people are probably going to tell you that there are just these periods where they don't feel like they're qualified. But everyone looks towards them as if they are the resident expert. And it's a challenging thing that most people don't really know that this kind of happens to everybody.
It happens to everybody. And just like story time, in my previous job at Østfold University College, I've said this many times, but I was lecturing in pedagogical theory, and I was also dealing with a lot of the students that were doing their practicum. So they were out in the schools and learning to become a teacher. So then I would travel around, and then I would meet up with a student and their supervisor. And that supervisor would usually be a teacher. And that teacher, sometimes, that person could be in their 60s. So suddenly I, as just finished with PPU, let's say that I had 1.5 year experience within pedagogy, and suddenly I was supposed to sit there and, tell people how they should be a teacher. Mm-hmm. Together with a person who maybe, in some cases, been working as a teacher for 4 years. Then the imposter syndrome is real. You show up at the school, you meet up with the student, they look at you as an authority, and then you meet this other person which knows and can quite easily spot that you don't really know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So then you really need to stick with what you know. So I always tried in these conversations to get to muster up the courage as well, I'm not going to sit here and teach you guys how to be a teacher. But what I can offer is that I know how you are supposed to write your thesis. Mm-hmm. What should be in it. What you should try to do. How you can gather data. How you can kind of turn this into a scientific text. So I'm not going to sit here and try to teach one who's been working for 4 years in the profession how to do it correctly. Because that would be... Mm-hmm. I don't think that would be a good idea, to be honest.
Not necessarily. But I mean, there's also the other side of that coin is that those people who are, have been in that profession for 30 or 40 years might also end up feeling like an imposter as ideas and knowledge and approaches change if they haven't kept up with it.
A lot of these people, you have to remember, as a supervisor for many students, they were always constantly in touch with new inventions within pedagogy and stuff like that. So a lot of these people were quite interested in their profession. So it was something about it was something that I got used to do, and I got used to kind of navigating these conversations in what I think was the right way. It kind of this is my competence. I can tell you how to do these things, but I'm not going to tell you how to act in a classroom with a bunch of 14-year-old people because I don't know how to do that.
And so a lot of it comes from obviously developing experience. So I think the first stage of this imposter syndrome is sort of this feeling of being an amateur. You lack the experience. You might have really good ideas. You could be very knowledgeable. You could be very well read. And I mean, I definitely feel that. as I'm sitting here trying to publish things for a PhD for people who quite clearly have been working in the field for, again, 20, 30, 40 years, and trying to communicate new ideas to them, and receiving very critical feedback of, is my idea good or not? And, you you kind of face a lot of rejection as a PhD, and not quite learning how to read between the lines and gain experience, the necessary experience through something like publication, to see what is actually said that is good about the work that you're doing, to make you realize that, but actually, I am onto something. There is a valuable idea here. It's really easy to kind of, as an amateur, knowing that you're an amateur coming into something as a novice, maybe taking that rejection a bit too hard, and that further enforcing this sort of imposter syndrome. And this is certainly something that I think doesn't just happen, at a PhD level, but
No.
obviously as you come into any career, and try to present new ideas or new ways of approaching things or solving problems or doing
any
tasks.
activity.
Yeah.
Or any type of activity, like approaching some kind of, group of experts or people that are familiar with some kind of activity, and you're the beginner. It's always uncomfortable to feel like a poser, to feel like you don't really know. This is something that I'm familiar with from skateboarding, obviously, climbing, every other kind of activity where there's always a select group that are the experts, the best skateboarders, the best climbers,
the gatekeepers, right?
It could be the gatekeepers,
Yeah.
but not always. Like, usually the ones that are the best, they are, for the most part, just concerned about their own performance. But then you have people beneath them, and that's usually the gatekeepers, because they can't really have the top spot, so then they need to demonstrate their position by, excluding other people that are not true Norwegian black metal or whatever.
Yeah. The true skaters, the true Pokemon card collectors,
The true people. This is something that we talked about another day. I don't know if you talked about this during some kind of just conversation between you and me, or during a podcast, but it was just to demonstrate this kind of effect or the dynamic. I think there's some kind of island let's say that it's in the Pacific Ocean. I don't know, but let's just pretend that it's in the Pacific Ocean, and there's a people there, and one day one guy or girl, for that sake, decided to, what, screw this, I'm not a part of this anymore, I want to start my own people. And then a couple of people was like, yeah, I'm also fed up with this system. I'm with you, let's go. So they decided to go to the other side of the island, and then they called themselves the real people. Keeping it real. Yeah. So it kind of demonstrates the same dynamic. Sorting people in and out groups. But now this is a digression. Let's get back to Imposter Syndrome.
But I think it's a good digression because, this is sort of a way of dealing with the imposter syndrome, because when you feel it, it tends to be something that causes anxiety or fear, fear of being found out, fear of being called a fraud, anxiety for this idea in your own head that people are going to kind of find you out and, hold that against you in some way, or depression of feeling that you're never good enough. And these are very, very real psychological emotions that we have to deal with as people in any kind of, social environment. So how do you deal with this, especially as a student, where I would say kind of the general perspective I had of moving through a bachelor and a master's is that you're just kind of a pupil, sit there, contribute a few of your own ideas, but mostly just read the course material, study for the exams, absorb knowledge, and regurgitate it. Restate the necessary facts and theories and concepts to pass.
It's but like internalizing a bunch of information. That's
just remembering a bunch of information and maybe understanding it. And then, you come to the master's thesis, and working at the Writing Center while also taking my master's in writing a thesis, I really kind of got a firsthand experience that I wasn't alone in a lot of these ideas of, is my research good enough? Are the methods I'm using the right methods? Are my questions good enough? Am I even doing anything that is interesting or worthwhile to anybody other than me? And so I was just working with a lot of students who are facing these same sorts of problems, this sort of anxiety or fear of kind of being a fraud or doing poor science, and that they were going to end up in the defense being found out and failing, and that caused a lot of kind of anxiety and depression. But I think having those conversations and talking to people about this idea of the imposter syndrome, and kind of looking over what they had done and checking, the logic of the argument that they were forming, and encouraging them, like, speak with your professor or your supervisor about the data that you've collected and how you have collected it, and how you have analyzed it. Having that relationship with the supervisor or with another professor who you have a good relationship with is important, because what you need is sort of this reinforcement, so that you don't feel like all that you're getting are your own negative thoughts and negative comments from other people. Because as we've talked about in previous episodes, the way that a lot of people provide feedback kind of focuses mostly on criticism and not on construction. And again, my story time, having just read over some recent comments, how you kind of read through review comments that have rejected something that I've put in a couple of years and several months of writing and rewriting and submitting and resubmitting, to find, I've got pages of negative comments. Okay, should I sit there and read all of these negative comments? Like, I don't need to worry about it because the journal's not accepting it. But there's probably some stuff in there that could be constructive.
Probably
for
some
me.
Valuable information.
Yeah, and so what I did is I skimmed through to just try to find the positive stuff first. And that was a big help to make me kind of feel like I was getting over this imposter syndrome, because 2 of the 3 reviewers rejected it. One of them accepted it. And the comments of that one who accepted it had a lot of really good points that resonated with a lot of the preliminary research that I had been doing in my pilot study on this same topic that I had written about. And a lot of those people in the pilot studies were saying things like, yeah, this looks really good. This is a really helpful tool. This is something that should be studied. And it feels a bit weird to have 2 experts in the field who are readers of this journal to reject it and give pages and pages of comments, because it immediately is going to make me feel like I'm not good enough. But having read that one other reviewer that resonated with other things that I've heard kind of reinforces, no, there's something here. I obviously haven't made it clear to these people, or one of them clearly doesn't understand that I'm not writing it for this specific group. I'm writing it for like this other group. And you kind of have to dissect a lot of this stuff and find out what comments are you receiving that are actually valuable and helpful. Because sometimes the negative stuff there is actually just a standpoint or opinions that people have, which are not necessarily aligned with the opinions of other experts in the field either.
No, sure. That's true. Another just interesting aspect of imposter syndrome is I think it's very much connected to other people. This sounded a little bit banal, but let me just explain this a little bit better. Let's use skateboarding as an example. If you try to land a difficult trick, or a trick that is difficult for you, you're probably gonna, let's say that you do a couple 100 tries before you land it. That's not unrealistic. If you try to do something which is, I remember days in my teenage years, an entire day trying to land one trick, get it on video, and then not landing it, going back the next day sore, trying again, and like continuing that process. I don't know how many attempts you maybe made, but let's say it's 100 attempts or something before you did it. I never felt like an imposter. I felt like a failure, but I felt like a bad skateboarder, but I never felt like an imposter. Mm-hmm. I've only felt like an imposter if there's somebody else there that can judge your performance.
Yeah.
So not being able to do something and the consequences being very real. You fall over, something happens to you, something very physical happens. You are rejected in a sense, but you don't feel the rejection the same way as if somebody tells you, oh, that's not good.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an interesting thing.
Yeah, but so it's definitely something that happens in groups, right?
Yeah, it's very like a socially driven phenomenon in a way.
Yeah, both of us skateboard. When you do things that are much more individual, and I guess it comes down to your approach to and how you judge yourself. And maybe this is the hard part about research then, is that you feel like you're always going to be judged. But, skateboarding or playing guitar or mountain running, anything like that. I mean, if you're doing it for pleasure, your own enjoyment, I mean, you're not really going to be that concerned over who judges you and whether they even have the right to judge you. But in a research environment, obviously, you're going to feel a lot more pressure.
Yeah, but still, a lot of people share their results, their achievements, and then compare that to other people. And a lot of people compete as well, even on an amateur level. So then it's, then you're into the kind of competition aspect of it that is quite, unfortunately, really similar to research. There is a competition for, publishing an article in a publication or in a journal or something like that. There is a competitive element. And then you always got the academic superstars, the ones that, went straight into a Ph.D. position after their master's degree. And, there's also a lot of competition involved and judging other people's abilities, I guess, and products.
Yeah. And I guess that's part of it, right? Is that, you as a researcher, you're always trying to compare yourself to other people's research, other people's results. And again, in relation to, this recent experience that I've had, one of the reviewers had ended up making the comment that, well, all of this stuff that is contained in here has been more thoroughly described in greater detail by other people previously. So there's no new contribution. And it's sort of, you have to take this moment to stop and think like, wow, does that really completely discredit my whole idea? Is it true? Yes. A lot of these things, and that's why I'm relying on these ideas and references from these other people. Yes, these things have been thoroughly investigated, but not together.
No, so then there is something different that you brought to the table.
I could have succumbed to the imposter syndrome and just been like, you know what, he's right. Why am I even wasting my time on this? Why am I even taking a PhD trying to fit these ideas together? And so, I think that kind of comes down a bit to the sort of gatekeeping that can end up happening, where you do need to understand that science changes, and science is not democratic either. You have to kind of come up with some kind of an idea, a theory or a concept, or, in my case, like bridging different theories and concepts together under this umbrella of interdisciplinarity, and then realizing that, well, anyone who comes from a disciplinary silo are going to reject a lot of these ideas because there's too much that's outside of their understanding of the world.
Yeah, their box.
Yeah. So it gets very, very difficult. Like, yes, that person was absolutely right. This stuff has all been discussed, but it hasn't been discussed in relation to this, and this, which have all been independently looked at as isolated elements. So, like that imposter syndrome could really easily kick in when you feel that, well, an expert is telling me that I'm wrong, but, you kind of have to look a bit beyond that and think, again, looking for that, talking to other people who might see the value in what you're doing to reinforce that you're not a fraud and your ideas are actually of good quality and worth pursuing. So I think it's important that you always kind of, you check in as a student, as a PhD, as a career researcher, to talk with people who do sort of understand some of the value in what you're doing. Just to reinforce the idea if it is actually worth pursuing or not.
From different perspectives and different disciplines. I think that's extremely valuable. I think one good analogy is I'm quite into board games. As a kid, I was playing a lot of different like card games and board games and stuff like that, and then I got into chess a little bit when I was a kid. Kind of forgot about it. Got back into it as an adult, but not that much. Just playing from time to time. And to me, having a conversation about board games with a person who's full-blown chess player, it's impossible. Because that's the superior game. That's the best game. It's like discussing music with someone who's into classical music or jazz. It's like you're not getting anywhere because they're playing the game or they're listening to the music with the highest cultural significance, or you know.
They place it at the highest rung of the ladder. Right?
Yeah. It's like, so they have nothing to learn. It's the perfect game or the perfect genre. And there's like luck, for example, luck in a board game, throwing dice or something like that. That's completely out of the question. To be honest, it does introduce a new kind of mechanic into the game where there's suspense. There's something is left uncertain. There's Las Vegas. There's a gamble.
Yeah.
Which have a tendency to make people extremely excited. So it's a good game mechanic to a certain extent for some people. But, trying to tell that to someone who's only into chess is you're not getting anywhere. And it's kind of the same as discussing something.
How do you bring forward?
A person,
how do you bring forward evidence that there are other games that are
good,
objectively better than chess?
It's not going to happen. And it's kind of the same as I'm just comparing it to, you talked about like disciplinary silo, or you could also call it like almost like an echo chamber, I guess.
Yeah, that there are disciplines that they do act as these gatekeepers, and the point of the field is to sort of strengthen the field. And this is sort of an interesting idea when you get into interdisciplinarity. Like if you ever want to feel like an imposter, become an interdisciplinary researcher because you don't fit anywhere. And a lot of people don't see the complete perspective of what it is that you're trying to do. But it's interesting because, there's all of these calls for things like interdisciplinarity and more cooperation and understanding between different disciplines to create a better understanding of the world that we live in. Yet, when you really sit down and try to do this stuff, a lot of people want to reinforce the disciplinary perspective that they have. And so understanding that, a lot of this imposter syndrome as well can ultimately be coming from the environment that you're in, and you might experience less of it if you are working within something that is like fairly rigidly defined, and it has its conventions and its expectations for the research already laid out. There are right ways to do it. There are wrong ways to do it. I would say, fields like engineering and mathematics. But then again, you kind of stop and think that how many major breakthroughs have come out from people who were probably ridiculed when they first presented their mathematical calculations. And it took a long time for these sort of disciplinary perspectives to shift. And that's what I was trying to mention with that science isn't democratic. It's not that everybody gets together and says one day, like, okay, we're taking a vote on and majority rules as to which theory we choose to believe in this year. It's that these things build and change and evolve slowly over time. So if you are in a field that's emerging, if you are at the kind of boundaries of your research, you're probably going to feel more like an imposter because you're trying to push past what has been established, and you're going to be pushing against fairly well entrenched beliefs and biases that are there that are probably well founded, but maybe incomplete.
And there's to just a bunch of interesting analogies back in, to different mythologies, to worldviews, to history, where if you sailed beyond that island, that's the end of the earth.
Yeah, you fall off the edge.
You fall off the edge. Like, don't go there. It's not going to happen. It's exploring new territory always brings with it a lot of uncertainty, and also haters back home telling you that this is a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is. And it's the same in every arena of life, in my opinion.
And you won't know until you try. Maybe you're like me and the research seems to be pointing somewhere when a lot of non-academic professionals are saying that there's value in it, but the academics are saying there's no value in it. Maybe you're onto something there, that there's a clear disconnect between practice and theory, or who knows, maybe I actually test it out and it doesn't work and it's all wrong and I am the one who has to reevaluate things, but there's still potency for learning and change and evolution that can happen there. And I have to then confront the idea that, maybe the work I've done is wrong, but then a good researcher will figure out, well, why was it wrong? What was I doing that kind of led me to an incorrect conclusion? And I think that this sort of leads nicely into the other topic that we had wanted to talk about, which I think one of the major causes of this imposter syndrome kind of ends up coming from this realization that we don't know everything there is to know about stuff.
No,
and this is,
you feel like you don't know anything.
Yeah. So that moment of being, really confident when you come into something, only to find out that you really don't know anything about it and fall into this imposter syndrome.
You discover that something is so complex that it's like, oh, there's so much to learn. There's so much information. I don't know what anything means. I don't know how it relates to each other. Like, it's just very difficult to know, left and right, up and down. That feeling, that loss of control, I think it's really one of the most important components of the imposter syndrome. But you talked about the stage before that, when you think that you are, we go into something new and it's like, this is something I never tried before. Probably gonna, let's just wing it. It's probably gonna, I think I'm pretty good at this for some strange reason. I think I'm above average.
Yeah.
Why?
It's like this is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it began from research in psychology in 1999. And it's a really interesting thing. So I think the reason that we wanted to talk about both the imposter syndrome and the Dunning-Kruger effect is for how well they kind of overlap.
And at the same time, they kind of they're at the opposite sides of the spectrum in a way. In a sense, but they also overlap because you can kind of start out with thinking that you're going to master some kind of activity, and then I saw a picture earlier today. There was like a guy that had like a medal, and it said like 200 meter. He won got like a participation medal for swimming 200 meters, and then he decided to try to swim from England to France. He thought that was like the logical, like that seemed like a reasonable.
The confidence was higher than the actual competence level. So the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially you've got two axes, and I'll put this in the show notes for anybody who wants the clear visual. But you begin with an incredibly high level of confidence that you are capable of doing something, whereas you begin realistically at a very low level of competence, of actual ability in it. So think about this in your own life. How many times have you just seen something and think like, yeah, I can do that? And the one that always comes to mind is, when I hear people who say stuff like, oh, wow, you're so talented as a musician. You're so talented as an artist, as a drawer. Oh, you're so talented on your skateboard. Like using this word talent as if it's just this miraculous thing that you're born with, and it doesn't come from a long time of building up your competence over
practicing
days and months and years of regular practice, right?
Going through the grind. Yeah.
So, but I think what happens is a lot of people, they enter new things with this high level of confidence that they're able to do it, but a very low level of competence. And there's sort of this overshadowing that happens, that the overconfidence masks any actual weakness that they end up having. So people tend to overemphasize their abilities when they start with something. And then what happens? Well, we immediately try it and find out that it's difficult. right?
I've seen
we
that
don't
happen,
have the talent.
I've seen it happen many times in both, playing guitar, skateboarding, climbing. People, oh, that looks easy.
Yeah,
And then
I
they
can do
can't
that.
even pull off the first hold, or can't even stand on the skateboard, or can't even, play the simplest chord or something like that. So it happens all the time and I think that the problem is, I try to have this kind of, I would say, my approach is usually that if there's some kind of activity or some kind of field within scientific within the scientific community, I try to think that there is in most cases infinitely complexity in anything. So you can kind of, if someone has a PhD in it, or a bunch of different people has a PhD in it, you probably don't know too much about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no reason to have a very concrete opinion about something. So, because the Dunning-Kruger effect also plays in when discussing important things within politics, for example. I've done this many times in my teenage years. I think you have as well. You probably have, a couple of beers in, talking with an adult about something very complex in global politics you don't know anything about, and then you have like a very firm opinion.
Yeah.
You know the answer. It's like, is immigration good or bad? Like, having a very firm answer to that is probably not a great idea, because it's extremely complex.
Yes.
It's
exactly.
Extremely complex.
But you kind of hit the nail on the head right there, that people who don't have a lot of experience in things tend to feel more confident in their understanding,
because
or
it's
in
less
their
complex.
Yes.
It's easier to navigate. That's what it is. It's less options. It's like, okay, I think blue, yellow, and red, then I'll choose red.
And so we see this all the time, and politics is a really good one to start with. Think about how simple political slogans are. Think about how simple a lot of electoral platforms are. Think about justifications for going to war or whatever it may be. There's always the very simple answer. And I think, as you become a researcher, you're going to encounter this at the start too. You have a lot of opinions and ideas and self-confidence in something, and then you actually start to research it, and you start to realize, wow, my opinion needs to change. My perspective on this topic, it's a lot more complicated than I thought. And what happens is that confidence level drops really quickly. And this
extremely healthy, I think.
Yeah. And so I think there's two things that we could talk about here, aside from it being, obviously an incredibly healthy thing to do, having a reality check. One is that as a student and as a novice researcher, be you a bachelor, a master, or a Ph.D., or early in a career as well, especially coming out of university, if you think you know everything and then you actually have to go and practice it, you might find out the practice is more complex than what you learned in a book. So there's some humility that can end up happening there. And I think that it's important to recognize that sudden drop of confidence can be associated then with the imposter syndrome, as you fall into what the Dunning-Kruger effect might call the valley of despair. Very low confidence, very low competence. But then you start to study it, and you get over this thought of like, oh, I'll never ever be able to understand this. And there's a period of growth, and you start to understand the complexity of these ideas. Things start to make sense to you. Will you ever be highly confident in the work that you do? Probably not. The more competent you get in things, you kind of check that confidence a bit, because you understand that there's potentially infinite complexity in some of these things.
And that's kind of maturity in a way, I would say. Just understanding that, okay, this is a very typical thing, but you see that people tend to have very strong opinions about stuff they don't know anything about.
Mm-hmm.
People
you
that
just
know a
have
lot
to go
about
to the
something.
pub to see that.
Yeah. Like, I don't have to take any examples, because I just thought about an example that doesn't really fit a podcast, but it doesn't matter.
At least maybe not the kind of podcast that we're usually making.
No.
We'll make our R-rated podcast. We'll see how this one does, and we'll see about making the explicit version later. But I think that leads to the second point of this, that we also need to realize that as researchers, the more nuanced things become, we're going to start encountering people who are at the very start of this, where they know so much more about it than we do. And I think that as a researcher, there's ramifications to this in how is it that we start to interpret the world around us, but how do we also sort of see the way that scientific ideas are delivered to people? Is there, and I think that this is stuff that ends up happening quite often in journalism. Conflation of numbers, for example, using statistics in a certain sort of way to almost hyperinflate the confidence of understanding, whether it's for a positive or a negative effect of something. So, for example, the AstraZeneca that had just the blood clotting issue that had happened there. It's good that that gets brought up to public attention, I believe. But the way in which it is brought up and the percentage that is demonstrated, or the proportion of people who are affected by this, it almost overclouds the surrounding complexity of how that vaccine is applied and who might actually be at risk, and is it actually still effective or not? And I think a lot of researchers struggle with this in seeing how simplified their research can end up becoming to the eyes of people who have no competence around these things.
And how it becomes a political tool, because right now, there's so much fear around Corona, for a good reason, of course, but the blood clot issue, like, as far as I know, there's in a large scale, very, very few people that happens to. It's very unfortunate that it happens, and I think it's important that people are informed that this can happen, but at the same time, we can't really pretend that like this isn't giving a lot of ammunition to the anti-vaxxers, because it does. So let's kind of explore that a little bit, because I think that the Dunning-Kruger effect is one of the most important components when it comes to being a conspiracy theorist.
They live at the start of that graph. High on the Y, low on the X.
Yeah. And I also think they feel really alienated from... Okay, so I saw this, I think it was like a YouTube clip. There was a flat earther that was having a beer with like a physics professor or something, right? And the conversation was really interesting because it was very obvious that the flat earther, he didn't know anything about standard, like what can you call it? You can call it I don't know too much about this either, but fundamental physics. He didn't know anything about fundamental physics, so he feels really alienated from it. So his lack of competency makes him believe a set of theory. You could almost call it almost like a religion, to be honest.
Alternative facts, isn't that the official journalist term?
But it's extremely important that one important aspect of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the one who is incompetent fail to see their own incompetency.
Yes.
Because they need a certain amount of knowledge to be able to see what they do wrong or what they don't understand. So I feel that it's extremely important for people that get really into conspiracy theories that they fail to see how this is just a conspiracy theory, how it's and they don't have the necessary knowledge that will kind of pop that balloon right away.
And a lot of this leads into, especially if you're a student or a researcher, what we're going to talk about in our next episode, which I think we're tentatively titling Spotting Bad Science. I came across something called The Rough Guide to Spotting Bad Science that I think is worth doing a dedicated episode on. But what happens here is, we start encountering a lot of overlaps between this Dunning-Kruger effect, high confidence in your opinions on things, and then starting to fall into this trap of relying on pseudoscience, not really taking the necessary measures and precautions to suss things out. And I think maybe that happens because, we're bombarded with information. Right? You can't possibly know everything there is to know about everything.
No, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Think about, you wouldn't be able to make any political decision whatsoever because the reality is so complex, then it would just like drown in
And it takes...
You wouldn't be able to do anything.
No, it takes time, and it takes effort. And the more and more that I study what I'm studying, both in pedagogy and writing, the more I realize there's so many different ways to kind of achieve the same thing. So which is necessarily right? Maybe what is right is what works best for you. And in my other research for the Ph.D., this sort of infinitely complex way in which you can apply a method, you really start to realize that, it's so complex that even to try to simplify it to be able to write it is incredibly difficult. But I mean, in the process, there's all of this work that goes into building a more nuanced understanding of the topic itself. And with the Dunning-Kruger effect, that reliance on confidence, quick facts, quick reads, something that you found on the internet, something that appeared on one of your social media feeds, something that a friend told you. I mean, I'm sure that if you were someone who was growing up as a kid or a teenager through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there's all of these ridiculous things that we have in our mind that were just urban myths created, who knows where, that we ended up believing just because somebody had said it and they were very confident in that fact. Again, some of them are maybe some X-rated things that are not worth saying on an educational podcast, but some very ridiculous things that were never true, were never founded in reality, that started as a rumor. And now with the internet, we have to even be better able to figure this stuff out for ourselves, but it's easy to rely on something that seems confidently reported, and it's the same story everywhere. To go and dig into the results and actually see, so where's this information coming from, and how well written is this story, and what's the reputation of the author. All of that sort of stuff erodes your confidence, not just obviously in where you're getting the information from, but in your own opinion on the matter as well, leading down into that kind of valley of despair, and which then, if you're in an academic environment or a career environment, kind of gets you into this feeling of the imposter syndrome as you're faced with the complexity of what you're really looking at.
But it usually means that you're a critical thinker.
Yeah.
So it's actually a good thing.
The valley of despair isn't something to be despairing of. It's just part of the process.
No. It's bring the pain. I think it's important. And as I tried to demonstrate with my story when I was traveling around and, having these conversations with pretty seasoned teachers about pedagogy and the right and the wrong approach to different things, I think it was important for me to kind of understand my shortcomings in these scenarios and then cling to what I know. And then really demonstrate that, but also clearly demonstrate what I don't know, and that gave me some confidence back, and also something that I can kind of build on. I could connect all these experiences of traveling around to this kind of core that would eventually, at the point you feel confident in what you're doing, and you know how to navigate these conversations.
Confidence builds again. But that's such a good point, that acknowledging what you don't know and letting that be an opening for you to go and find new information and new ideas, and to think critically about something by not closing off doors and saying, no, this is what I believe. I'm not going to look into the things that I don't know about this, because it could erode that belief. And realistically, I say this all the time when I'm working one-on-one with people, but I think one of the first steps to being a good researcher, or a good scientist, or a good critical thinker is accept that you're probably wrong. Because if you can live with the fact that you're wrong, you're able to get through that valley of despair, lose that confidence, start at a more acceptable or real level of what you truly know about something, and try to find things that will help to build a more correct view of the world, and expect that might also end up being overturned in the future.
The challenge here is something that I've been thinking about, a lot, to be honest, and it's people have a tendency to accept their physical limitations a lot easier than their mental limitations. Let me explain this one. If I tell you that do you think that you could beat the world champion cross-country skier?
No, not at all.
No. You couldn't.
Wait, hold on. Like in skiing or in a fist fight? Still
Fist
probably
fight.
no.
Fist fight, yeah, because I know you're not a boxer. They're probably in super good
They're
shape.
probably in way better shape. All those, the triceps and laterals that they have from
Like
all
if they
those
hit you once, you're down.
skistabber motions.
Yeah, probably like quick as
I would get my ass handed to me in either.
Yeah, I would probably the same thing would happen to me. The point is that you would lose that race. And no one has a problem with that. I don't feel insulted. I don't feel belittled. It's fine. If I lose against the world champion in cross-country skiing, I'm cool with it. Or even, the best one in Fredrikstad, the city that I live in. I don't really do cross-country skiing, so there's no reason that I should be any good at it. Mm-hmm. And I can accept that. But if I'm in a conversation with someone, let's say a political scientist, and they challenge my opinion about something, people have a tendency to feel really attacked, and they have a tendency to feel dumb. And that's the problem. There's a difference between knowing that you're not physically able to lift 200 kilos, because you know that, okay, you have to train for that. But you also have to train for thinking about certain things. Mm-hmm. It's not really different, but it just feels different. You feel dumb. You don't feel dumb because you can't beat the world champion in cross-country skiing, but you do feel dumb if your opinion about immigration or about gender equality or something like that is challenged by an expert. That feels uncomfortable. Yeah. So I think that's also an important aspect of it that we kind of need to kind of get rid of. We need to acknowledge that somebody is an expert in something because they actually invested a lot of time into it.
And if they're a good expert, they're going to assess on the quality of, so what does this idea bring to the table that is new? And of course, this is one of the hard things, especially in academia, but you'll experience it in other social circles and other professional groups as well too, where, if there's that one person in the group that thinks, no, there's only one way to do it, and it's the way that I'm doing it. Those people who act as sort of gatekeepers, that's the stuff that sort of reinforces imposter syndrome and reinforces that valley of despair and feeling like you might be stuck there if you feel like that is what you're kind of constantly experiencing. So again, if I were to summarize all of my thoughts and opinions on this, it's that the great thinkers are open to a lot of these ideas, and they're willing to look at the evidence that's brought forward, and they're willing to look at the ideas and where they come from and the support behind those ideas instead of necessarily just blocking things off. And maybe that's potentially because there's that imposter syndrome on the other side, as new ideas come in and threaten people's opinions that they have spent a long time developing and building up. Maybe on their side, they might feel like, oh, well, this is an attack to try to make me look like a fraud. I mean, you'd need to talk to those people one-on-one and see if they believe that or not. But
I think that's a good point, because it's very complex. Talking about the imposter syndrome and the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's actually, I think personally that there's a lot other parameters that kind of affect what somebody thinks about something. So when reading up to this podcast, there was I was reading this article about some of the studies that have been done, and it was like one of the studies would confront people with like a statement of some sorts. It could be that I think one of the statements was something like, Obama did a great job to make the economy greater when it was kind of bad, or something like that. And then they were presented or confronted with another statement that was conflicting with that statement. And the same people would say that both are right. Mm-hmm. And that would in turn demonstrate the Dunning-Kruger effect, because they feel very confident in answering something that they don't really know anything about.
Yeah.
I honestly think that there is another phenomena here in play here as well. There's maybe those people didn't really understood that these two things are conflicting. So that can mean different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that they know very little about it, but it can mean that they didn't really catch the construct of the question. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
like it's kind of
when
like a
you're-
trick. It's
Yeah, when you're presented with very simplified yes, no answers, and your focus is like, yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. You know, the emphasis is more on the response than on thinking about what the question is.
to really explain. I remember,
And it's obviously
about-
simplifying incredibly complex information, especially when a follow-up question is contrary to the first
Or- yeah,
question.
yeah, and maybe
Because
they
some of that, of
misread it.
course, is like, as a responder, you might not notice it, but as a researcher, that immediately points out to me that, oh, okay, what this research is obviously designed to ask questions that demonstrate conflicting responses, that people don't have a full grasp of a much more complex system.
Another interesting thing about Dunning-Kruger effect, but also is another article that was talking about how we as a species always look for patterns and try to, piece together information to create some kind of narrative or explanation to some kind of phenomena or something. And a lot of it is related to what babies do or kids do, where they can say things like, let's say that I think one of the examples was, why does trees produce oxygen? And then a kid would say, yeah, so the animals could breathe.
Mm-hmm.
So the animals have air. That would be so everything has agency, right? Everything has agency. And they tested this out with scientists that were supposed to run through a test. It was like a bunch of different statements, some of them false, some of them true. And when they were false, they were kind of prescribing agency to something. It could be like the Earth has an ozone layer to protect the animals from radioactive rays from space or something like that, right? So, and when they were giving as much time as they wanted on the test, they performed pretty well, and they would usually, choose the answer that didn't have any agency in them. But when it was on time, when they only had 3.5 seconds to answer each question, everybody the results were very interesting because they have a tendency to choose the statements that prescribed
ones that were maybe
agency to something.
most direct.
Yeah, not even most direct, but the ones that gave things agency. So, for example, the theory of evolution that that the cheetahs can choose if they want to, emphasize speed versus something else, and that's how evolution works. Not that it's just a kind of random selective process of, they get food easier, they, all that kind of. It's kind of this idea that it's driven forward by some kind of by will and choice and agency, and that's an interesting aspect of the effect.
Yeah. I think we should remember some of these for the next episode, because you start to get into how do you make counterclaims, or how would you justify giving agency to something instead of understanding. I think evolution would be a good case. People who don't really have a lot of understanding in how evolution works, or even a relative perspective of geologic time. Because a lot of people measure things just in human lifetime and their own lifetime experience. It gets difficult to even fathom hundreds of millions or billions of years. So, you kind of, it's easy to then come up with these sorts of counterclaims. And there's a lot of confidence in that. There's not always a lot of evidence because, to understand it requires time, work, the willingness to move through the valley of despair and kind of find yourself in a state of not knowing anything, which I think discomforts a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, because
we like to be right.
And not only that, we like to preserve our worldview because it's comfortable to us. It's comforting. It's, when everything kind of collapses around you, that it's not a comfortable feeling, and sometimes that could be what they think about as the fundament of society, of ethics, of morals, of I'm talking about stuff like religion. It's full of giving things agency.
Yeah. Or as many parents probably have experience with, the because clause.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, your answer is just a clause. It doesn't continue because.
Because it is
Why
like
this?
that.
Why that? Because it is. Because I said so.
It,
You know.
and what they're kind of saying, because this question is challenging the structure of society, and
Or sometimes it's
I
even
don't know
just
how to deal with that.
because it's challenging the boundaries of what that person actually knows and is
Oh
competent
yeah, yeah.
in knowing
In
to be able
answering.
to describe. And I remember being one of those little kids who was probably just pissing everybody off all the time. Like, so how come I learned in science class when I'm, 7 years old or whatever, heat rises. Then why is it that the upper atmosphere is colder than the surface of the earth? Explain that to me, huh?
And
And
it was just like,
luckily I grew up in a
ah.
town that has a world-renowned museum of evolutionary biology and paleontology.
Oh, so you could
So I was
always
like full of people
get
with
over there.
Ph.Ds. and people who were, climatologists and people who were basically people who were very, very well educated in a lot of this. So there were parents out there who could explain these sorts of things in a way that, like a 7 or an 8-year-old could kind of understand. But I realized that later on in life, not everybody was in that kind of environment, and not everybody as a kid asked those sorts of questions either and had someone who could respond in that sort of way. So yeah, and like as a kid, you probably don't have a huge amount of confidence. That's why you're asking these questions, because you want to know. You accept that you don't know, and that's, you're curious about everything. We
And
kind of
that's
lose
how
that,
you learn
right?
about that's how you navigate in your
Yeah.
own reality. That's what it is. You collect a bunch of information, and that maps out reality, and then you know what to do. It's not really. I'm not saying that it's obviously more complex than that.
Yeah.
That's kind of the one very important mechanism. So you should always give them the best answer you can, and if you don't know, just say you don't know.
Yeah.
But we can try to figure it out. Talking about the the imposter syndrome. You're not a parent, but I am. And I can tell you something. When you become a parent, that's something that you definitely feel at the beginning. Like when
Oh,
you're
I
at the
bet.
hospital with a newborn baby next to you, like, oh, now you're
And there's no manual.
now, now you're the father. Like, and you're like your father. I remember how I looked up to him. I remember, how that he was a sense of security, all these kind of things, and now you're that person. That's quite strange. And you get this feeling. I remember the first night at the hospital with my son next to me, and I was like, I can't. It's like it was kind of
There's
this
the
feeling
valley
after.
of despair.
Yeah. It's like after my wife had been giving birth for 12 hours or something, and it was very intense, very emotional experience, and then you're kind of tired, and it's at night, and it's just so much going on at the same time, and you're like, I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah. Confidence completely eroded.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah.
yeah, I think that this was just a good episode to do because, I mean, it's going to trail so nicely into what we want to talk about with kind of bad science and how there is a lot of confidence. And we'll probably spend more time dedicating to talking about real experiences we've had with people who have brought in bad science wanting to write about it. And how that is really, they're at the peak of their Dunning-Kruger effect, at high confidence with low competence. And we have to be the people to like force them into that valley of despair and how
Despair,
difficult
yeah.
that can be for some people.
Just one thing before, like, I think it's important to talk about as a part of this episode. One thing about bad science is that it sometimes can be very appealing, especially to people that are, talking about going back to the conspiracy theorists. I know the anti-vaxxers are always going back to this one like study that was done where the person was claiming that vaccines would turn people into autists.
Yeah.
And it was like this was a scandal. Obviously, the results were manipulated, stuff like that. But that never really, like, it had.
It's like you would say, the cat is out of the bag.
The cat is out of the
facts
bag.
don't matter. The story is so much more interesting. Yeah.
The phenomenon, the story, the everything, and sometimes bad science can be very. there's something about the lack of complexity that some people
Yeah.
find very appealing, because then it's a very like straightforward, firm. This is what it means. This is what it is.
Yeah.
Talking about it's delivered with confidence.
The simplicity of it, high amount of confidence. But when you look into it, and all of this is going to tie into talking about, the 12 pieces that you can use to look for bad science. A lot of these sensational headlines kind of hit on many of them. But that's the point. You're not selling truth. You're selling stories, right? In journalism. I just watched a movie, Mank, which is about Hollywood screenwriters and stuff like that. I'd highly, highly recommend it if you like old classic style movies. It's modern film, but I think they kind of get into some of these issues of how manipulation happens and how the media can be so easily used. Entertainment can be used to inform changes. And there's a couple lines like, in Hollywood, you can convince people that, King Kong is 40 stories tall and that this actor is still a virgin at 40. And people will believe it, right? And they kind of use that to steamroll some political movement that ends up happening in relation to the storyline. But, I think that that's important that, as a researcher, even just as a regular news reader, like really pay attention to some of these sensationalized headlines or simplicity of arguments to try to figure out what's really going on in there. That high level of confidence, if there's no sort of, and maybe this is why everyone is always like, oh, well, scientists, they never seem to have an answer for anything. Well, that's because we are aware of what we're not aware of. We're aware that there's some uncertainty. We're aware that what we know today could change tomorrow. And we're open to changing with it if the evidence is in much stronger support. So
it's the kind of same, like, let's talk about like climate crisis, right? What's the right approach? And then there's like you can ask the most renowned climate scientist, and he's probably cooked down some some things that we can do because he's get interviewed all the time. But at the same time, a lot of these things they're so complex. They have so many. Every action has so many. Like,
and they'll say stuff we won't know for another 10, 15, 100 years.
What happens?
No. Yeah.
Like, what happens if you do this? Who knows? Like, there will always be some kind of reaction to something you did that you didn't really anticipate. And I always think about this. I remember when it was wasn't it in 2008 that the second Iraq war started? Wasn't it in? I think so.
Probably. It's been a while since I've looked into it.
Or was it before that? It was with Obama. I'm pretty sure. Doesn't matter. I remember I was before. I think I was in like high school. I think. I'm not sure. Anyways, I remember I was watching the invasion like when I was eating breakfast, and then it was a lot of like Norway as a social democratic country has always been very like critical to, especially the United States and their kind of imperialistic approach and so on. I'm not going to get too much into that. The point is that always wanted to like withdraw the troops, get out of Iraq. But then when they did, there's always this like suddenly there's no one to run the infrastructure. There's so
it became incredibly complicated.
It that happens, and suddenly these sub-milits groups would pop up.
Yeah, fill power vacuums and.
So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that it's so complex that you never know about all the different consequences of something, because it's every action, ends up in so many different reactions that you wouldn't see coming. Very philosophical episode, this one.
Yeah, it's been a little philosophical, but you can join us for the next episode, the thrilling conclusion to all of this, as we talk about how to spot bad science and maybe even some logical fallacies. And if you tune in, it's going to be all right.
I thought about saying something like, if you are experiencing the valley of despair, it's going to be all right.
We could just have a double ending. And, if I don't clip any of it out, then if I do clip any of it out, we can always use it so that we have some quirky remark to close out the next episode. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave it all in because we got plenty to talk about next time. So Nicholas, thanks I know we kind of went off on some different tangents there, but I mean, this is stuff that we're going to face as students, as researchers, as career academics, or in our careers elsewhere. So why not use as many examples as possible?
And it's so complex anyways.
Exactly. We're going to be the first to admit that we don't know everything there is to know about this. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode, everybody.
See you in the next episode.